Let's dive into the wild story of Dr. John R. Brinkley and the bizarre birth of medical radio quackery. Back in 1918, a fake doctor literally answered this by shoving goat parts into a Kansas farmer. Wild, right? Brinkley charged the modern equivalent of 12 grand in cash for this entirely unscientific, deadly procedure. During the Roaring '20s, people feared aging. Brinkley totally exploited this with a relentless, aggressive advertising campaign. His absurd method was biological nonsense. That loose animal tissue, yeah, it caused gangrene, not magical rejuvenation. To expand his sketchy empire, Brinkley built KFKB, a super powerful radio station blasting across the Great Plains. His strategy was brilliantly insidious. He'd hook you with country music, then peddle fake medical diagnoses right on air. He diagnosed listeners live, then directed them to buy completely useless prescriptions from his massive, lucrative pharmacy cartel. By 1930, this insane radio infomercial scam was generating a staggering $500,000 a month. But that wealth attracted wrath. Dr. Morris Fishbein relentlessly exposed Brinkley's lethal, unsterilized butcheries in medical journals. Authorities finally pushed back, completely stripping Brinkley of both his broadcasting and medical licenses in 1930. Furious, Brinkley ran for Kansas governor. He nearly won, until political bosses tossed out tens of thousands of ballots. Defeated in America, he just exploited a massive legal loophole, building an unstoppable border blaster station in Mexico. Extra was so insanely powerful, it literally hummed in barbed wire fences and bled into car radios nationwide. Hubris finally ended him. He foolishly sued Fishbein for libel, demanding $250,000 in damages. Fishbein's defense paraded grieving widows, absolutely proving Brinkley was just an ignorant butcher performing deadly intoxicated surgeries. It only took 2 hours for the jury to clear Fishbein, legally declaring Brinkley a complete medical fraud. This verdict unleashed massive lawsuits, IRS audits, and a government treaty that silenced his mega transmitter forever. In a deeply ironic twist, the man who butchered thousands died completely penniless and missing a leg.
Brinkley literally laid the blueprint for modern media manipulation, weaponizing the airwaves to sell pseudoscience to desperate people.
So it leaves us wondering, just how many of Brinkley's loud manipulation tactics do you still see today? I will fill your Morena reservoir to the brim. I will deliver 40 inches of rain. You will pay me exactly $10,000. I mean, just imagine hearing that incredibly audacious promise. You're standing in this scorched, bone-dry landscape under a relentless, blinding California sun. The earth is just cracked clay stretching all the way to the horizon, and there's this hot wind whistling across a totally barren basin. It's truly a life-or-death situation for the people living there, and that desperation completely sets the stage for our story today. Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to a true historical thriller. We're talking absolute desperation, rampant pseudoscience, and a frankly unbelievable legal paradox. In today's Explainer, we're looking at the story of Charles Mallory Hatfield, the man who walked into a desperate city and promised him the one thing that money supposedly couldn't buy: the weather. We are going to explore how a sewing machine salesman somehow managed to convince an entire major American city that he possessed divine control over the sky, only to be chased out of town by the exact same rain he claimed to have summoned. To really get why this happened, we have to look at the sheer desperation in San Diego back in December of 1915. The city was quite literally choking on dust. For nearly 4 straight years, barely a single drop of rain had fallen across Southern California. Crops were totally withered, livestock were dying out in the fields, and the city's primary water supply, the Morena Reservoir, was sitting at less than 1/3 of its total capacity. And the timing? It literally couldn't have been worse. The city council was in a total panic because San Diego was just about to host the massive Panama, California Exposition. They were expecting hundreds of thousands of tourists, and they were completely, flat out, running out of drinking water. Enter Charles Hatfield. He strolls into City Hall, 39 years old, tall, slender, wearing this sharp wool suit and just projecting this intensely quiet confidence. He gives the city fathers this completely irresistible, zero-risk proposition. He says, look, I will deliver 40 inches of rain over the next 12 months. The city doesn't have to pay a single penny up front. No rain, no pay. But if he succeeds, it's going to cost a cool $10,000. Now, in 1915, $10,000 was a small fortune, roughly $300,000 today. The city council, they looked up at the cloudless blue sky, they looked at their angry, desperate voters, and they just signed the verbal contract. They figured they had absolutely nothing to lose. Now,
You might be wondering, why would a city council even entertain something like this? Well, it's because of a booming turn-of-the-century concept called pluviculture. As America's westward expansion pushed millions of farmers into these highly arid, dry plains and deserts in the late 1800s and early 1900s, desperate communities turned to rainmakers. These were, by and large, charlatans. They claimed they could force clouds to open up using dynamite explosions, electrical currents, or in some cases, mysterious chemical vapors. And Charles Hatfield? He was the undisputed king of the rainmakers. But he wasn't your typical flashy, theatrical salesman traveling in a carnival wagon. He built his reputation on this quiet, serious credibility, referring to himself as a moisture accelerator.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is Hatfield's incredibly methodical process, right? Because he adamantly denied using magic. He insisted, up and down, that this was pure chemical science and atmospheric physics. His setup was identical every single time. First, he'd build a 20-foot-tall wooden tower in a high-altitude location, usually near a reservoir. Second, he would place these large, galvanized iron vats at the very top, filled with a secret cocktail of 23 different chemicals. And third, he'd set fires beneath the vats, cooking this mixture until these noxious, foul-smelling fumes billowed up into the atmosphere, day and night.
Hatfield's claim was that these chemical vapors acted like a giant magnet, drawing moisture right out of the atmosphere and forcing the clouds to drop rain directly over his tower. But let's look at the reality here. Hatfield's true secret formula was brilliant risk management combined with immense meteorological literacy. I mean, the guy spent years meticulously studying historical weather patterns, barometers, and regional climate cycles. He simply never operated during seasons where rain was mathematically impossible. He'd wait until historical data heavily suggested a natural rain cycle was due, fire up his smoldering vats, and just wait. If it rained, boom, he claimed total credit and collected his check. If it stayed dry, he just said atmospheric conditions were unfavorable and moved on to the next town without charging a fee. It was an absolutely ingenious, completely risk-free business model.
Let's move to 11s and see how this builds into an absolute catastrophe, because it really spirals out of control. On January 1st, 1916, Hatfield and his brother hike deep into the pine-covered hills near Morena Dam. By January 5th, they light those chemical fires. Thick plumes of yellow and gray smoke start drifting into the sky. For 48 hours, nothing happens. But then, this dense blanket of gray storm clouds rolls in off the Pacific. A soft drizzle begins, and let me tell you, the citizens of San Diego are cheering. The local newspapers are printing front-page stories praising Hatfield's miraculous powers. But then, by January 10th, the drizzle turns into a steady, uninterrupted downpour, and by January 14th, that downpour transforms into a violent tropical deluge. It rains for 4 days straight. And up on the mountain, completely oblivious to what's happening below, Hatfield just keeps happily shoveling chemicals into his burning vats.
The rain was no longer just falling, it was literally drowning the county. The immediate consequences were just devastating. The Sweetwater River completely overflowed its banks, ripping out thousands of citrus trees and just smashing farmland to pieces. The San Diego River? It turned into a half-mile-wide, raging torrent of mud and debris. It washed away telephone poles, drowned livestock. Train tracks and roads simply ceased to exist. The entire city of San Diego was severed from telegraph lines and completely cut off from the rest of the world. No trains could run in or out. And still, Hatfield blindly kept his chemical fires burning.
By January 20th, the weather actually cleared up briefly, which gave the crippled city this horrible false sense of hope. But the nightmare was far from over. 4 days later, on January 24th, a second, even more powerful atmospheric river slammed directly into the already fully saturated Southern California soil. Up at the Morena Reservoir, the water level was rising by feet every single hour. This reservoir, which had sat practically empty for 4 years, was now completely full and violently spilling over its stone emergency spillways.
The tension finally breaks on January 27, 1916. Downstream from Hatfield's tower sat the Lower Otay Dam, which was this massive steel-faced rock-fill structure holding back billions of gallons of water. At exactly 4:05 p.m., completely unable to handle the immense volume of water pouring down from the mountains, the Lower Otay Dam suffered a catastrophic structural failure. It literally split right in half.
The sheer destructive power of what happened next is honestly hard to even fathom. A 30-foot-high wall of water roared down the Otay Valley at 50 miles an hour. Try to picture that. 30 feet high, 50 miles an hour. It obliterated absolutely everything in its path.
Entire homesteads, vast orchards, massive barns, bridges, and railroad tracks were just swept straight into the Pacific Ocean in a matter of minutes.
The horrific aftermath left more than 20 people dead and hundreds completely homeless. Millions of dollars in property damage had been inflicted over the course of just 3 weeks, a period where San Diego County received nearly 30 inches of rain. Complete martial law was declared to keep order. And those desperate citizens who had been praising Hatfield just weeks prior? Yeah, they formed an angry lynch mob. Men were openly talking about hiking up to Morena Dam with rifles to hang the rainmaker from his own wooden tower. Forewarned by a local forest ranger, Hatfield and his brother were forced to abandon their vats, disguise themselves in rough working clothes, and flee on foot through flooded, dangerous mountain trails all the way to Los Angeles.
But this is where the story takes a truly unbelievable turn. Several weeks pass, the waters have finally receded, the initial shock is sort of settled, and Charles Hatfield calmly walks right back into San Diego City Hall, unharmed, wearing his pristine wool suit, casually carrying a portfolio of rain gauge reports, and he presents the city council with his bill, $10,000. He points out very matter-of-factly that he promised to fill the Morena Reservoir and he had fulfilled his contract to the letter, successfully delivering over 13 billion gallons of water. As you can imagine, the city council was absolutely flabbergasted.
So the crucial point is how the city actually responded to this, because the city attorney offered Hatfield an absolute genius of a legal ultimatum. See, the city was now facing over $3.5 million in flood damage lawsuits from incredibly angry citizens. So the attorney looks at him and says, "Mr. Hatfield, if you accept credit for creating the rain that filled our reservoir, then you must also take legal responsibility for the flood that destroyed our valley. We will gladly pay your $10,000 fee, provided you sign an agreement assuming full legal liability for the $3.5 million in damage claims." It was an inescapable double bind. Hatfield was completely trapped by his own hubris. If he accepts the credit, he goes bankrupt and probably to prison. If he denies the fault, he proves he was a fraud the whole time, and he loses the fee anyway.
Hatfield, of course, flat out refused to sign that liability waiver. Instead, he actually sued the city of San Diego for breach of contract. And this lawsuit dragged through the California court system for over 2 decades. Finally, in 1938, 22 years after the Great Flood, a California court officially ruled that the 1916 deluge was an act of God. This was a brilliant ruling because it legally relieved the city of liability for the damages, and it officially declared that Charles Hatfield's chemical towers had absolutely not caused the rain. Hatfield never received a single dollar from the city of San Diego.
And this brilliantly illustrates the reality of what actually happened, grounded in modern meteorology. We now know for sure that the 1916 deluge was caused by a massive, rare El Niño weather pattern interacting with an atmospheric river directly over Southern California. It was just a massive, entirely natural climate cycle. This deluge was going to happen whether Charles Hatfield lit his chemical fires on that mountain or not. Hatfield eventually just faded into obscurity during the Great Depression. He went right back to his old job selling sewing machines before passing away in 1954.
Hatfield really remains one of the most fascinating figures in American history. It's a crazy testament to human desperation and our seemingly endless desire to just bend nature to our will, which leaves us with a lingering thought as we wrap up today's explainer. The pseudoscience of pluviculture is safely in the past, sure, but the desire to play God with the sky, that certainly isn't. Think about modern geoengineering and cloud seeding programs happening right now. If we ever possess the technology to truly fully control the weather today, who would be legally responsible when the next dam breaks? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning what you see on the horizon.
Okay, picture this. It's a rainy, foggy night in San Francisco, December 1870. The gas lamps are flickering along Montgomery Street. The heavy oak doors of the Bank of California swing open, and in walk these two sun-scorched, weathered guys. They're wearing battered leather boots, carrying mud-stained saddlebags, and they look exactly like weary prospectors who have barely survived months out in the Wild West. So they ask to see a high-ranking bank official, but they don't want a loan. Instead, one of the men, a quiet Kentuckian named Philip Arnold, plops this heavy leather bag right onto a polished mahogany desk. Without saying a single word, he unties it, tips it over, and out tumbles this cascade of unrefined, rough stones. Under the gaslight, the banker is staring at fiery red rubies, deep blue sapphires, green emeralds, and rough, glittering diamonds. I mean, the banker actually gasps, because back in 1870, North America was believed to be completely empty of precious gemstones. If these were real, it meant an untapped fortune worth tens of millions of dollars. So, welcome to our explainer on one of the absolutely most audacious cons in American history.
Now you might be wondering, who actually confirmed these were the real deal? Well, listen to this quote. That is a direct quote from Charles Tiffany. Yes, the legendary founder of Tiffany & Company, the undisputed authority on precious stones in America at the time. He literally held these exact stones up to his eye loupe, examined them for 2 full days, and declared them a geological marvel. He was utterly, completely fooled by what we now know was just an elaborate mirage. So the big question is, how on earth the 2 humble, dusty prospectors managed to deceive not just frontier bankers, but literally the greatest gem expert in the world?
Section 1. The setup. Hooking the Gilded Tycoons. To really understand how this happened, we've got to look at Gilded Age San Francisco. This was a city entirely drunk on silver and gold, just desperate for the next massive strike. The Comstock lode over at Nevada had just created overnight millionaires, and everyone, from bankers to stagecoach tycoons, was looking for a way to double their fortunes. The city was primed, wealthy, and honestly, highly gullible. So the brilliant part is how our prospectors, Philip Arnold and his cousin John Slack, totally weaponized that greed. Think about it. Your typical scammer brags, right? They overhype the product, they push super hard to close the sale. But Arnold and Slack understood human psychology with terrifying precision. They knew that bragging would immediately raise red flags. So they did the exact opposite. They played hard to get. They deposited their gems in the bank vault just for safekeeping, acting super paranoid that rival prospectors were following them. When the founder of the Bank of California, William C. Ralston, cornered them in a hotel room, basically begging to buy into their discovery, Arnold pretended to resist. He acted like a simple country bumpkin who just didn't want big city capitalists stealing his hard work. And this brilliantly illustrates a core truth about human nature. The more reluctant Arnold acted, the more desperate the titans of industry became to hand over their cash.
And that desperation had a very specific price tag. Arnold and Slack finally, reluctantly agreed to a deal. The investors would fund an expedition and an expert evaluation. If the diamond field proved real, Arnold and Slack would receive an unbelievable payout of $660,000 in cash. To put that into perspective for us today, that's roughly $16 million. Plus, they were promised a massive equity stake in the new mining company. The bait was taken, and the hook was set.
Moving right along to Section 2, the illusion, the blindfold, and the salting. So, having investors on the hook is one thing, but Arnold and Slack actually had to create a physical illusion robust enough to fool top-tier mining experts. And the sheer logistical brilliance of this heist is wild. It basically breaks down into 4 steps. Step 1. Arnold and Slack took a $20,000 cash advance from the investors, sailed all the way to London, and bought up thousands of dollars of low-grade, industrial-quality uncut diamonds, rubies, and sapphires, which were basically just the sweepings from South African and Indian mines. Step 2. They take those scraps back to New York, mix them with their original haul, and present them to Charles Tiffany, who, as we saw earlier, completely swallows the bait. Step 3 is the salting. A week before the official inspection, Arnold and Slack travel to a remote red sand mesa in the Wyoming Territory called Black Butte. They literally get down on their hands and knees with pocket knives and hand drills, sticking rough diamonds into cracks in the sandstone and poking rubies into anthills. Finally, Step 4, the blindfold test. They guide the syndicate's trusted mining expert on a multi-day train and horseback ride, keeping him strictly blindfolded the whole time so he can never pinpoint the coordinates on a map.
That expert was a guy named Henry Janin. And when he finally stepped off his horse, took off his blindfold, and dropped to his knees with a trowel, he was absolutely stunned. Within hours, he was pulling diamonds out of the dirt with his bare hands. He saw anthills literally sparkling with tiny red rubies. Honestly, it's almost comedic to think about an educated mining expert finding pre-cut sapphires inside an anthill and falling for it. But he did. He fell for it so completely that he wrote this glowing endorsement, famously declaring the site to be the richest mineral deposit on Earth, capable of producing $1 million a month.
Section 3, the score, a $10 million mirage.
So with Tiffany's appraisal and Janin's on-site verification, the investors had everything they needed. The trap sprang shut. William C. Ralston and his partners immediately formed the San Francisco and New York Mining and Commercial Company, capitalizing it at a staggering $10 million, which is nearly $250 million in today's money. The board of directors for this mirage was a literal who's who of 19th century royalty. You had Baron Ferdinando Rothschild buying shares from Europe. Civil War hero General George B. McClellan was on the executive board. Future U.S. senators and Supreme Court justices were lining up just for the privilege of buying stock at astronomical prices. The newspapers were going wild wild, declaring it the greatest geological miracle in North American history. And then, right at the absolute peak of this frenzy, our two quiet prospectors made their final brilliant move. They went to the investors and basically said, we're just weary prospectors. We don't really belong in fancy corporate boardrooms. They happily surrendered all their mineral rights and company shares, accepted their guaranteed $660,000 in cash, and completely vanished. Poof, gone. For nearly a year, the most powerful men in America just sat back holding what they thought was the ultimate golden goose, preparing to launch full-scale mining operations, fully believing they now controlled the entire global diamond market.
Section 4. The Unraveling. The geologist who knew.
But, as we know, every grand illusion has a flaw. Ours came in the form of Clarence King. He was this brilliant, uncorruptible 27-year-old government geologist. What King knew for a fact was that diamonds, rubies, and sapphires all form under completely different tectonic pressures and volcanic conditions. Finding them all mixed together in the exact same shallow sandstone layer made absolutely zero geological sense. So King tracked down the secret location using clues from the travel notes, got down in the freezing mud himself, and here's what he found. First, the ratio of rubies to diamonds was mathematically identical across every single square yard of the site. Second, the diamonds were only found on top of raised mounds, never deep in the rock. And third, the absolute smoking gun. King found a rough diamond still lodged in the rock that bore the clear, unnatural grooves of a metal hand drill, right where Philip Arnold had forcefully wedged it into the stone. King systematically dismantled the greatest hoax in America, literally on his hands and knees.
So King rushed back to San Francisco and delivered his devastating report. The real-world shockwave that followed was incredibly destructive, and the fates of our main characters were straight out of a movie. William C. Ralston, the great financial titan, saw his $10 million company collapse overnight. He was totally disgraced, his financial empire completely crumbled, and he eventually drowned in San Francisco Bay under, very mysterious circumstances. John Slack, the quiet cousin, slipped into the Arizona wilderness and was literally never heard from again. And Philip Arnold? He had retreated to his hometown in Kentucky and bought himself a luxurious estate.
When Ralston's lawyers finally tracked Arnold down, the sheer injustice of the outcome was just wild. Arnold hired top Kentucky attorneys and totally played the victim card. He argued he was just a simple, honest prospector who got framed by greedy West Coast bankers. To avoid a long, drawn-out trial in a completely hostile local court, the San Francisco bankers actually agreed to a settlement. Get this, Arnold handed back a mere $150,000, keeping the remaining $500,000. He walked away a wealthy, free man, eventually dying in a shootout with a business rival a few years later. Which brings us to the core mystery of this entire explainer. Seriously, how do the smartest minds in the world, Charles Tiffany, Baron Rothschild, the foremost banking titans of the West Coast, fall for the greatest lies? How did no one stop to ask how rubies and emeralds were just sitting right next to pre-cut sapphires in a Wyoming anthill?
It all comes down to this timeless equation. Flattery plus artificial scarcity plus greed equals absolute blindness. Philip Arnold and John Slack didn't just hack the geology of a Wyoming mesa, they hacked the psychology of the Gilded Age. They knew that if you make powerful people feel like they're part of an exclusive, secret club, and you dangle the promise of unimaginable wealth just out of their reach, their greed will override every single critical thinking skill they possess. It's a really stark reminder for us today. When the promise of easy money enters the room, logic usually runs right out the back door. So the next time someone offers you an exclusive, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that seems just a bit too good to be true, you have to ask yourself, are you looking at a genuine diamond or just another salted anthill?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a truly mind-blowing piece of medical history. We're looking back at an era completely defined by American weird science scams. This was a time when fraudsters were literally convincing people they could turn water into gasoline. So keeping that wild backdrop in mind, we're going to investigate how a celebrated, cutting-edge health tonic turned a prominent 1930s American socialite into a living, breathing nightmare. It's a story about the dawn of a new scientific era, our endless thirst for miracle cures, and the absolute devastation of unchecked commercial greed.
Picture this. It's New York City, November 1930. We're in a dimly lit, incredibly plush room at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Manhattan. The heavy velvet drapes are pulled tight against the gray morning light, and sitting on the edge of the bed is Eben Byers. Now, Byers was a 50-year-old steel tycoon, a champion golfer, and basically the quintessential American playboy. He was famous for his relentless energy, his massive wealth, and his good looks.
But on this specific morning, he's surrounded by a tray of empty 2-ounce glass vials that are faintly glowing green in the shadows. And Byers himself, he looks absolutely horrific. He is quite literally decaying while still alive.
Over the preceding 3 years, Eben Byers had consumed a staggering 1,400 bottles of a highly expensive patented medicine called Radithor. He had injured his arm on a train ride after a Harvard-Yale football game back in 1927, and his doctor recommended this tonic to help him bounce back. And get this, it was actually advertised directly to consumers as a cure for the living dead. I mean, what a slogan, right? Well, Byers felt such an overwhelming rush of vigor after his very first sip that he started drinking up to 3 bottles a day. He even shipped cases of it to his friends. But, as we'll see in just a moment, that initial rush was a deadly illusion.
Okay, let's move to Section 1, the radium craze, the magic element.
So back in 1898, Marie and Pierre Curie discovered radium, and it sent absolute shockwaves through the scientific world. Seriously, imagine seeing this mysterious element for the first time. It glowed in the dark, it generated its own heat, and early lab trials even showed it destroying cancer cells. Because it seemed to just radiate continuous, endless energy, and because researchers noticed natural hot springs with trace radon gas seemed to soothe arthritis, marketers jumped to a wildly flawed conclusion. The public tragically misunderstood radium. They didn't see it as the highly dangerous heavy metal that it actually is. Instead, they hailed it as the fundamental spark of life itself. To the everyday consumer, this wasn't science, it was pure magic.
And this lethal misconception? It sparked a booming, frankly bizarre industry of radioactive consumer goods. You had radiocosmetics selling thorium-laced creams for a literal glowing complexion. You had Doramad toothpaste promising to nuke your oral bacteria with nuclear rays. People were even buying radium ore revigators. These were earthenware crocks lined with uranium, just so folks could charge their daily drinking water overnight. The driving assumption of the 1920s was dangerously simple. If a little radiation was good for you, then more must be an absolute miracle.
Which brings us to Section 2, the fake physician and the perfect poison.
Enter our villain, William J.A. Bailey. Now, Bailey presented himself to the world as this brilliant medical mind, a Harvard-educated physician and a scientific miracle worker. But the reality was much, much darker. He was actually a college dropout and a convicted male fraudster who had already spent time behind bars. Remember how I mentioned this was the golden age of American weird science scams? Bailey was operating right on the heels of the infamous 1916 gasoline from water hoax, where con artists easily duped a scientifically illiterate public into believing cars could run on doctored water. Bailey saw how incredibly easy it was to fool people desperate for the next technological miracle. He noticed his competitors were selling fake radium products, mostly just plain spring water, and decided to pull off a much more sinister grift. He set up the Bailey Radium Laboratories in New Jersey and decided to sell the real, deadly thing. His product, Radithor, was simply a 2-ounce bottle of distilled water laced with concentrated, highly lethal isotopes of radium-226 and 228.
Now, to dodge the early drug laws of the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, Bailey didn't just put Radithor on pharmacy shelves. No, he marketed it directly to licensed medical doctors as a high-end prescription, complete with these slick pseudo-scientific pamphlets claiming it cured over 150 different ailments, everything from chronic fatigue to high blood pressure. And to absolutely guarantee sales, he offered these doctors a secret 17% cash kickback on every single bottle their patients ordered. Plus, at $1 per vial, which was about $18 in today's money, it was incredibly expensive. That high price tag turned it into an exclusive status symbol for wealthy elites like Eben Byers.
Let's dig into the biology in Section 3, Anatomy of a Poison.
So remember how Eben Byers felt that sudden, amazing rush of energy? Well, low doses of internal radiation actually briefly stimulate the bone marrow to produce red blood cells, which creates this temporary, completely illusory high. But the biological reality happening inside the victims was catastrophic. You see, the human body chemically mistakes radium for calcium, so every single time Byers drank a bottle, his system took that radioactive heavy metal and deposited it straight into his skeleton. And once it's locked inside the bones, the alpha radiation literally begins breaking down the molecular bonds of the bone tissue. It was cooking his skeleton to dust from the inside out. Total cellular destruction, entirely masked as vitality.
In late 1931, the Federal Trade Commission sent an attorney named Robert Wynn to interview Eben Byers in his Ritz-Carlton hotel room. They were investigating Bailey for false advertising. Well, Wynn walked in and discovered a man whose upper jaw had been completely removed except for 2 front teeth.
The rest of his lower jaw was entirely gone. Holes were actively forming in his skull, and his whole skeletal system was disintegrating so severely that just the lightest pressure caused compound fractures. Byers could barely speak, and his breath could literally trigger a Geiger counter. But here's the most terrifying part. His mind remained perfectly, sharply clear through all of it. Wynne later filed a chilling report of the encounter, simply stating, "A more horrible experience could hardly be imagined."
To put this rapid decline into perspective, Byers started his daily radiotherapy regimen in 1927. By October 1930, he finally stopped, suffering from massive weight loss and agonizing jaw pain. Just a year and a half later, in March 1932, he died of severe radiation poisoning and kidney failure. He was only 51 years old. Because his remains were so incredibly toxic, health officials actually ordered him buried in a lead-lined coffin to protect the surrounding soil. Think about that. And when scientists exhumed his body 33 years later for a radiological study, his bones were still emitting dangerous levels of radiation. Experts say that radiation will persist for another 1,600 years.
That leads us to our final part, Section 4, the deadly legacy. The gruesome reality of Byers' death sent a massive shockwave of terror through the entire American public. I mean, the media fallout was swift, it was brutal, and it was highly effective. Take a look at this bluntly worded front-page headline from the Wall Street Journal. It perfectly captured the public's absolute shock. The radium water worked fine until his jaw came off. That single, terrifying scandal practically obliterated the radioactive health industry overnight. The FTC immediately issued a cease and desist order, permanently shutting down Bailey's laboratory.
But the injustice of the aftermath, it is honestly infuriating. While Eben Byers suffered a total skeletal collapse and was buried in a lead-lined box, William J. A. Bailey basically escaped justice entirely. Because patent medicines were just so poorly regulated back then, Bailey was never convicted of manslaughter or murder. He walked away with hundreds of thousands of dollars in profit, started up new companies, and died much later of bladder cancer in 1949. Though in a very morbid twist of fate, when researchers later exhumed Bailey's body, it turned out to be intensely radioactive as well. Turns out, the ultimate con man had actually been drinking his own toxic product.
Now, what you should really take away from this explainer is how this specific, horrifying scam changed American laws for the better. Fueled by the immense public outrage over Eben Byers and the equally tragic radium girls who painted watch dials, Congress finally passed the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. For the very first time, drug manufacturers actually had to legally prove their products were safe before they could sell them. It gave the FDA real enforcement power to rip toxic and deceptive substances right off the store shelves, completely revolutionizing consumer protection.
William J. A. Bailey sold literal radioactive poison and successfully packaged it as eternal youth. Today, we're constantly bombarded with new technological and scientific discoveries, things we barely understand, yet they're packaged as the next big health revolution. So, when cutting-edge science outpaces public understanding, how do we protect ourselves from modern fraudsters dressing up poison as medical miracles? It's a frighteningly relevant lesson from the past and a great reminder that critical thinking might just be the best medicine we have. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the miracles you see on the shelves.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely wild chapter of American weird science. We're going back to a time when the absolute magic of modern technology was literally strapped directly to the human waist. Imagine waking up every single morning, picking up a heavy, clunky contraption made of brass plates, copper wires, and red velvet, and just tightly securing it right against your bare skin. I know it sounds exactly like a medieval torture device, but to the people of the late 19th century, this was the absolute bleeding edge of medical science.
So, picture this. You're handing over the modern equivalent of $1,600. For what? The absolute privilege of dipping a raw wire into vinegar and shocking your own internal organs. Back then, that $50 price tag was a small fortune. But people eagerly, and I mean eagerly, handed over their hard-earned cash. They'd take these heavy metal belts, soak them in a bucket of acidic liquid, turn a dial, and just let a sharp, burning electric shock shoot right through their bodies.
And the craziest part? This wasn't some tiny fringe movement. Back in the late 19th century, starting right around 1890, in places like Chicago, millions of everyday Americans willingly subjected themselves to the stinging burn of these electric health belts. They wore them to work, they literally slept in them at night, and they were utterly 100% convinced that the painful, prickly sensation on their skin was the divine spark of life curing whatever disease ailed them. It wasn't just a fad, it was a full-blown cultural phenomenon.
Section 1. The age of electric magic, when Edison and Tesla inspired medical scams.
All right, to really get why anyone would zap themselves on purpose, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of someone living in 1890. Back then, electricity was essentially viewed as pure magic. Think about it. Thomas Edison was just starting to light up dark cities. Alexander Graham Bell was sending human voices through solid copper wires. Nikola Tesla was basically throwing lightning bolts. To the average Victorian, if electricity was powerful enough to power an entire city grid, well, why couldn't it light up the human body? Scammers totally capitalized on this awe, specifically targeting a completely made-up condition called neurasthenia. Medicine was in a really weird transition period, and doctors were handing out this vague nervous exhaustion diagnosis to city dwellers for basically everything: fatigue, indigestion, depression, brain fog. The prevailing theory of the day was that modern industrial life, the factories, the loud noises, the city stress, was quite literally draining citizens of their vital electrical charge. People were convinced they needed to recharge their internal batteries.
Section 2. The Blueprint. Isaac Pulvermacher's shocking battery belt.
This whole painful trend was kicked off by an Austrian engineer named Isaac Louis Pulvermacher. Back in the 1850s, he noticed all this societal anxiety and decided to invent a solution that would cash in on the public's total obsession with electrical currents. He came up with the galvanic chain. This was a flexible belt that essentially turned the human body into a crude, wet, prickly battery. And the process was intense. You wrapped these alternating zinc and copper links around your waist. Then you dipped the flannel lining in vinegar or diluted acid to trigger a real chemical reaction. The end result? A continuous, low-voltage, direct current that shocked your bare skin. This wasn't some trick of the mind or a placebo sensation. It was a literal physical shock.
He went all in on the marketing, launching this massive international juggernaut packed with legitimate-sounding endorsements. It made his painful belt an instant global sensation. Advertisements screamed out from newspapers across Europe and North America like a carnival barker, yelling things like, "Electricity is life, restore your lost vigor, cures rheumatism, paralysis, liver complaint, kidney disease, and spinal weakness without medicine." He basically declared his belt was a wearable electric battery for the human body. And because the public was so desperate for a miracle cure to survive the grueling stress of the Industrial Revolution, they bought it in absolute droves.
Section 3. The Evolution. Dr. Scott's Magnetic Empire.
Now, if Pulvermacher built the foundation with those awful acid burns, an American who called himself Dr. George A. Scott totally perfected the grift by making it sleek, pretty, and best of all, pain-free. Scott showed up in New York City in the late 1870s with absolutely no record of a medical degree, but a sheer genius for mass marketing. He realized that Pulvermacher's belt smelled terrible, like vinegar, and left chemical burns, and he knew he could do way better. He expanded the market with these elegant items sold right out of catalogs like Sears Roebuck. He sold an electric hairbrush that promised to cure baldness and dandruff for about $100 modern. He even sold an electric corset targeting women, claiming it cured spinal curvature and female weakness. These weren't clumsy, acidic chains. They had elegant scrollwork and flexible steel wire, and Scott swore that hidden patented electric generators were tucked inside every single one.
But here is the catch. If you actually cracked open one of Dr. Scott's gorgeous electric hairbrushes, guess what you'd find? No wires, no batteries. You would find absolutely zero electricity. All the guy did was take small, incredibly cheap iron bars, magnetize them, and bury them in the plastic handle. And when actual scientists pointed out that, hey, rubbing a magnet on your head doesn't magically create an electric current, Scott completely ignored them. He just kept right on launching new products, like electric insoles and toothbrushes.
Section 4. The Psychology. Why the scam worked.
So despite literally zero science backing him up, Scott became one of the wealthiest men in New York. Which really makes you wonder, right? We have to look at the fascinating intersection of targeted insecurity and the human brain's desperate desire to believe in a cure. Ask yourself, how on earth could so many people be fooled into believing a stinging burn or a chunk of magnetized iron was actually curing their diseases? Why were there thousands of glowing testimonials from people swearing their paralysis or headaches were completely gone? Were they all just lying? Well, it comes down to a powerful psychological trick, the sensory placebo effect. Basically, for a Victorian patient, physical pain equaled medical success. If it stung, it must be working. Think about how we've used certain medicines even today. If a mouthwash burns, we automatically assume it's doing a great job killing germs.
For the Victorians strapping on those zinc-copper belts, that literal shock and the red, irritated skin it left behind was absolute, undeniable proof that the electricity was violently fighting off their illness. The placebo effect was massively magnified by the physical pain.
On top of that, these companies ruthlessly targeted deep-seated insecurities. They went after male sexual anxieties, things they vaguely called spermatoria and lost manhood. Products like the Heidelberg electric belt were highly targeted. Men suffering from exhausting or impotence were absolutely terrified of societal shame, so they bought these terrifying suspension belts with battery packs for the groin through discreet mail-order catalogs. If the belt completely failed, or worse, if they got horrible skin ulcers from the raw voltage, their own embarrassment guaranteed they'd never publicly complain. It was quite literally the perfect scam.
Before long, this whole electrotherapy thing blew up into a multi-million-dollar pop culture obsession. The market was absolutely flooded with hundreds of absurd knockoffs. Everyone wanted a piece of the action. You had the Addison, the Restoralex, and my absolute personal favorite, Dr. Sandin's Herculex belt. This genius little device actually featured a tiny, battery-powered red light bulb right on the front buckle. When he strapped it on, the little bulb lit up, offering undeniable, glowing proof to the wearer that those magical healing currents were in fact flowing right through their body.
Section 5. The Takedown, the Expose, and the Death of the Belt.
Thankfully, this massive electric health craze couldn't outrun actual medical researchers and crusading journalists forever. Investigative reporting, the American Medical Association, and the Pure Food and Drug Act systematically tore down the entire empire of electroquackery. The turning point was 1905, when Samuel Hopkins Adams dropped his massive expose, The Great American Fraud. He proved these belts caused severe lesions and revealed that many of those glowing testimonials were literally stolen from patients who had already died. Then, the newly formed AMA started rigorous testing, officially debunking the devices. The U.S. Post Office got involved, cutting off their cash flow by issuing fraud orders to block mail-order payments. And the final fatal blow was the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, which finally made it highly illegal to print false medical claims on product packaging. By the time World War I broke out, the entire industry was basically dead in the water.
Section 6. The Legacy, Rebranding the Magic.
Now, those heavy, rusty zinc and copper harnesses were eventually tossed into the junk heaps of history, but the psychological impulse behind them? That never really vanished. The belts themselves were gone, rusting away in Victorian basements, but the fundamental human desires that made guys like Pulvermacher and Scott incredibly rich are permanent fixtures of human nature. Today, we might laugh at the idea of a Victorian electric belt, but those exact same vulnerabilities completely drive the modern wellness tech industry. We look back at the 1890s and think, man, how could they be so gullible? But just look around today. We still fear aging, we still feel totally exhausted by modern life, and we are still incredibly eager to believe that if a gadget looks sleek enough and uses enough scientific buzzwords, it will miraculously optimize our bodies and fix all of our problems.
So, I'm going to leave you with this to chew on. Have we actually evolved past Pulvermacher and Dr. Scott, or are we just buying better-looking belts? The very next time you see an ad pop up for a biohacking wearable, a magnetic therapy ring, or some futuristic fight therapy mask promising to literally recharge yourselves, ask yourself if it's truly a scientific breakthrough or just a modern version of the galvanic chain. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning the magic.
All right, let's just jump right into this explainer. We look a lot at weird science and forgotten scams, but man, the one we're diving into today, it absolutely takes the cake for its sheer audacity and the wild cast of characters involved. We're heading back to 1916 to unpack a hoax that literally captured the imagination of the entire world, all orchestrated by a 72-year-old retired engineer named Louis Enricht. So, picture this. It's a crisp spring morning. Farmingdale, Long Island, April 16, 1916. You've got dozens of reporters in their trench coats and bowler hats, all crowded around this gleaming black Ford Model T. Standing right in front of them is Enricht, this older German-born engineer with a thick mustache and these sharp blue eyes. And he looks at this crowd of highly skeptical journalists and makes an unbelievable boast. He says, "Gentlemen, I have invented a substitute for gasoline that costs exactly 1 penny a gallon to manufacture, and its primary ingredient is ordinary tap water." Now, to really get why everyone lost their minds over this, we got to look at what was happening in the world at the time. World War I is raging, and global oil prices are just skyrocketing. Gasoline was selling for 25 cents a gallon. And I know, 25 cents sounds like absolute pocket change to us today, but back then, it was choking the life out of the booming American automobile industry. Plus, it was making John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil monopoly impossibly rich, which created this massive wave of public anger. Basically, the whole country was desperate, and they were incredibly hungry for a miracle.
Which brings us to part 1, the penny a gallon miracle.
Because a miracle is exactly what Enrich was selling. He walks these reporters through this perfectly choreographed illusion. First, he lets the newsmen crawl all over the car, meticulously inspecting the empty gas tank just to prove he hadn't hidden any secret fuel lines. Next, he has a reporter fill a regular old garden bucket with top water from the hose. A couple of the journalists even drank some to prove it was just water. Then comes the magic trick. Enrich pulls this tiny glass vial out of his vest, drops a little bit of this mysterious green liquid into the bucket, and stirs it up. The water turns this milky, pale green color and starts giving off this sharp, bitter scent, almost like crushed almonds. He pours the whole bucket straight into the Model T, cranks the starter, and proceeds to drive 6 completely mind-blown journalists around Long Island for half an hour. The news hit the international wires almost instantly. A man had figured out how to turn water into gasoline. Moving right along to part 2, duping Henry Ford. See, Enrich was brilliant at weaponizing that anti-monopoly panic we talked about, and it worked. It caught the eye of the biggest fish out there, Henry Ford himself. Ford absolutely despised the oil companies. He thought they were artificially inflating prices just to squeeze working-class drivers. Enrich played that angle perfectly. He put on this public persona as the selfless, humble inventor, promising that if Ford bought his formula, they'd give it away to the American people for free instead of creating another monopoly. But the reality? Enrich was hiding a 40-year rap sheet. The guy was a professional con artist on the run from fraud charges, everything from selling fake artificial stone formulas to embezzling from railroads. But he was a master at playing the trustworthy grandfatherly genius. And Ford completely took the bait. He sends over a brand new Model T and a check for 10 grand to negotiate an exclusive deal. But here is the absolute genius of the grift. Enrich never actually planned on selling the secret to Ford. He knew Ford's engineers were way too smart and would eventually demand a strict chemical analysis in a lab. So Ford was just a decoy. Enrich used Ford's money and the massive endorsement of having Ford's engineers around to build instant global credibility. And he did it without ever actually having to hand over the goods. So how did he actually do it? Let's get into part 3, the chemical illusion. You're probably wondering, right? How on earth do you get a car to run on a bucket of water? Well, spoiler alert, it wasn't magic, and it definitely wasn't water. It was actually a highly destructive application of basic industrial chemistry. That neon green liquid in the vial, it was a deadly cocktail, mostly made up of a concentrated mix of acetone and dissolved acetylene gas. Oh, and remember that bitter almond smell the reporters noticed? That was cyanide, literally prussic acid. Enrich deliberately added cyanide, not to power the car, but specifically to mask the chemical smell of the acetylene so rival chemists wouldn't sniff out what he was actually doing. So the crucial takeaway here is that the water wasn't powering anything. It was literally just a liquid carrier. When he poured the mixture into the tank and cranked the engine, the highly volatile acetylene gas would rapidly evaporate out of the water and get sucked right into the cylinders. Now, acetylene gas is incredibly flammable, so it detonated inside the combustion chamber just fine, which is exactly how he managed to drive the pistons for that 30-minute joyride. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. Acetylene burns at a ridiculously high temperature, and it releases all these corrosive byproducts. If you drove that car for just a few hours, that intense acidic heat would completely melt and destroy the engine's valves and pistons from the inside out. And on top of literally eating the engine alive, the whole financial claim? Complete nonsense. Making industrial quantities of acetylene gas cost way more than just refining crude oil. This was not a penny-a-gallon miracle fuel. It was an engine-destroying parlor trick that actually cost 10 times more than the gas it was supposed to replace. But hey, for a quick 30-minute spin around the block, it looked exactly like magic. That leads us to our 4th chapter, War, Paranoia, and Greed. So Enrich has the public hooked, right? But to really cash in, he leans hard into the panic surrounding World War I. Defense contractors were terrified that this revolutionary formula might fall into the hands of German spies. After Ford's initial visit in April 1916, Hiram Percy Maxim, the head of the massive Maxim Munitions Corporation, swoops in. Maxim figures whoever controls a cheap, non-petroleum fuel is going to control the outcome of the entire war. So he offers Enrich a staggering $1 million for the exclusive military rights. Enrich says yes, pockets a cool $100,000 cash advance, but then gets incredibly paranoid and refuses to write the formula down or submit to lab tests until he's fully paid. He makes a big show of hiding a secret envelope in a bank vault. When Maxim's chemists finally put their foot down and demand real tests, Enrich just walks away with the $100K. Next, he hooks a railway tycoon named Benjamin Yoakum for another $150,000 in cash. But by 1917, Yoakum is convinced he's accidentally funding a German spy, so he gets a court order to forcibly bust open that bank vault. I want you to just imagine the dead silence in that courtroom when they finally pry open the bank vault. The judge breaks the seal on the envelope that supposedly holds this world-changing million-dollar recipe to save the American war effort. And what's inside? 2 inexpensive Liberty war bonds and blank pieces of paper. Literally nothing. There was no formula. Enrich had siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars from these titans of industry and left absolutely nothing behind.
Which brings us to the end of his run. Part 5, the final grift.
So Yoakum sues him for grand larceny. But unbelievably, the guy just keeps going. Even while he's out on bail, literally facing serious prison time, Enrich sets up his final, arguably most audacious con yet. It's 1920, he's 75 years old, and he manages to convince a new group of Long Island investors that he's invented a mechanical process to extract pure gasoline right out of ordinary dirt, specifically peat moss. Once again, it's the exact same pitch, a miracle alternative to big oil, just wearing a different disguise. He actually manages to squeeze $42,000 out of his trusting neighbors just by showing them this weird peat machine in action. To put that in perspective, that was an astronomical amount of cash back then. The whole thing only came crashing down when one of the investors finally got suspicious and hired a plumber to poke around Enrich's lab. The plumber finds this hidden copper pipe coming out of the back of the peat machine, follows it through a false wall, and discovers it's secretly tapped right into an underground tank full of, you guessed it, regular old gasoline. That hidden pipe? Yeah, that was the final nail in the coffin. In 1921, at 77 years old, Louis Enrich was finally convicted of grand larceny and shipped off to serve a 7-year sentence in New York's infamous Sing Sing Penitentiary. He only served 2 years before they let him out because of failing health, and in 1923, he died completely penniless. But here is the wild part. While Enrich died broke, that powerful myth he created on his front lawn, it outlived him entirely. Which leaves us with one massive question that I really want you to chew on. Why are we still falling for this exact same water fuel scam today? Seriously, through the 1970s oil crisis, the 90s, all the way to modern internet scams today, dozens of fraudsters have popped up claiming they've invented a water-powered car or a magic pill that turns tap water into fuel. And every single time, they use Enrich's exact playbook. They exploit our frustration with monopolies, our anger over high gas prices, and our deep desire for an easy overnight miracle. Louis Enrich proved over a century ago that you don't need to break the laws of physics to make a fortune. All you really need is a bucket of water, a little green dye, and a world that is incredibly eager to be fooled. So the next time you scroll past a miracle solution online, just stop and ask yourself, are you just falling for the modern-day green vial?